Welcome. Catholic marriage is forever. This is sacrament of marriage. This is not just the same like civil agreement because God is involved in this. But sometimes this sacrament is not valid. And to have ability to marry again in Catholic Church, people have to prove that this previous marriage was never valid. This is possible to do this, and to talk about details, I am inviting today for interview my good friend John Rabski, who worked many years as a lawyer in canon law in Catholic Church in Edmonton and won't share with you his experience. Please listen.
So that's what I'll cover here in the next few minutes is what happens then a Catholic ends up divorced and he or she wishes to remarry in the Catholic Church but cannot automatically do so. According to Catholic practice with Catholic Church practice with divorced Catholics, they must obtain what's called in canon law, it's called a decree of nullity. In popular language, it's simply called an annulment. The person seeking an annulment, I'll use the popular term, annulment, goes to his or her parish priest and says, Father, I'd like to marry. In the Catholic Church, the priest starts asking some questions, finds out that the person is divorced, and sends the person then to the marriage tribunal. I'm only speaking for Edmonton here. That's the tribunal I worked in, and that's the one I'm most familiar in. So the person then phones the head of the tribunal, and the priest or caseworker that is assigned begins to ask questions. Were you married in the church? Yes, I was. And there are some basic questions that you go through first. So, supposing I'm the caseworker, and I have before me somebody who's divorced and is seeking an annulment, and you run through some basic questions. You expect a no answer all the time. For example, were you at least 16 and your bride at least 14? Okay, yes, I was 21, she was 19 or whatever. Were you a priest that wasn't laicized? No, I was never a priest. Were you in religious life under the vow of chastity that was never dispensed? No. Did you kill your ex-wife's spouse in order to marry her? No, I didn't. Did you abduct her in order to marry her? No, I didn't. Are you by any chance brother and sister? No, we're not. Okay, these are questions you run through. You don't expect a yes answer, but as a routine. The most common exception here is, and the most often that you get an affirmative answer is, are you a Catholic who married outside the church? Okay, of all these questions, that would be the most common one. Quite often a Catholic, for whatever reason, elopes, marries in Las Vegas or whatever, because a Catholic has to follow what's called the canonical form of marriage, which is you have a priest and two witnesses. Those questions, as I say, are very rare. 99.9999% of cases that the marriage tribunal deals with stem from In the church, there's a code of canon law. These are all the laws of the Catholic Church, and there are laws that govern Catholic marriages and the running of tribunals. So 99.99% of people that we get in the marriage tribunal seeking an annulment fall under Canon 1095. And there are 3 paragraphs in this canon that are guidelines who are potential or likely candidates for obtaining an annulment. And I'll just read these so that you have the wording. Canon 1095, the introduction says, the following are incapable of contracting marriage. Paragraph 1, those who lack sufficient use of reason. Paragraph, a second category, those who suffer from a grave lack of discretionary judgment concerning the essential matrimonial rights and obligations to be mutually given and accepted. And number 3, those who, because of causes of a psychological nature, are unable to assume the essential obligations of marriage. Okay, that's the legal wording, and I'll just talk on a simple layperson's terminology. So number 1, those who lack sufficient use of reason. I had a case a few years ago, a male and a female, man and woman, lived together in a group home. They weren't mentally ill, but their mentality, they couldn't sufficiently function in society. So they were in a group home for the mentally challenged, I guess you could call them. And they had emotions, they had feelings, they fell in love. The parents approved, both sets of parents approved. They were in their early 20s, if I remember correctly. But their priest, they were both Catholics, had serious doubts whether these two, formerly they were called feeble-minded. Okay, today we'd call them mentally challenged. The priest had serious doubts whether they even knew what marriage was about. But the parents put pressure. We want them to marry. Nobody else will marry them. They should marry each other. And so the priest finally concluded, well, these are very simple people. What could go wrong if they get married? So he married them. And it turned out to be a disaster. As it says here, they lack sufficient use of reason. Their minds, they had very little, if any, idea of what marriage was about. And it broke up. Okay, that's an example, a real live example of someone who lacks sufficient use of reason. They might have good intentions, goodwill, hope for the best, but we're dealing here with kind of the legal law. In legal law, they lack sufficient reason to know what they were doing. I'll skip to the third one because the second one is the most common. The third one is those who, because of causes of a psychological nature, are unable to assume the essential obligations of marriage. And so a person comes seeking an annulment, and usually they have a psychologist, psychiatrist report. They were not insane, or else they probably wouldn't have married, but all your mental, psychological illnesses that they had when they consented to marriage. Schizophrenics, paranoids, schizoids. Maria here is the psychologist. They got married, one or possibly both, but at least one was because of causes of a psychological nature, they were unable to assume the essential obligations of marriage. Okay, they were unable to assume. They might have wanted to, they might have had goodwill. They promised the spouse, I'll take my meds, I'll be under the care of a psychiatrist, whatever. They had the best of intentions, but because of a psychological nature, they were incapable of assuming the obligations of marriage. Okay, and when such a person would apply for annulment, or usually the other spouse, would have police reports, brutality, violence, burning down the house. They would have psychiatrist reports, psychological reports, counseling reports. It's like in a civil case where you have a lawsuit against somebody. You have all this evidence, paperwork and so on, called summary reports and that, to prove that my ex or myself was psychologically incapable of assuming and fulfilling the obligations of marriage. Those are fairly rare because you've got to be insane to marry an insane person almost. Like most priests wouldn't marry you if you were insane or something. But the root causes are there, and they might be unknown, and the pressures of marriage will trigger it. I could be, let's say, paranoid or schizophrenic, latent, but I'm okay on the outside. But buying a house, paying the mortgage, communicating with your spouse, and especially when children come along, then it's no longer latent. The lay term is he cracks up or she cracks up. They can't handle marriage, and then full-blown police involved and so on and so on. The second paragraph in this, of the 99.99 cases that we get under Canon 1095, 99.99 are in the second paragraph. I'll reread that. Those who suffer from a grave lack of discretionary judgment concerning the essential matrimonial rights and obligations to be mutually given and accepted. The best way I can illustrate this paragraph is by giving you examples. Again, two people marry. They exchange their consent to marry until death do us part, but something was so gravely, okay, and it can't be as simple. It has to be a more than serious, a grave lack of discretionary judgment. When they gave their consent, in their mind, something was so gravely serious that they will obtain an annulment. I'll give you examples, and these will clarify. Let's say a homosexual. He knows from an early age that he's a homosexual, but he conceals it, meets up with a female. It's hidden, his homosexuality, and she agrees to marry him. He marries only for public appearance. He might be an athlete, a mayor, the president of a corporation. He wants to hide his homosexuality. It's deception, a grave deception. He deceives his spouse-to-be, and a week, 2 weeks, or whatever, even a year after the marriage, she comes home, the house is empty, there's a note, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I was homosexual, I was hoping that marriage would cure me, it hasn't, I have a boyfriend, etc., etc., etc. Okay, another example, I put on the appearance to my girlfriend that I'm a millionaire. You will live on yachts and in resorts. They marry, and in fact, he owes $1 million in debt. Okay, deception, she was deceived. Another example, you find a woman knows that she can't bear children, but throughout the whole courtship, when we have children, okay, he is deceived. And then after the wedding, she says, honey, I can't have children, okay? Another common example, especially in former days, was pregnancy. Okay, a 16-year-old, 17-year-old gets pregnant. They marry only for the sake of the child, and yet when they marry, they are so immature that their consent to be married until death do us part, just humanly speaking, can't happen. Similar to that was what's called force or grave fear. In olden days, pregnancy, what was called shotgun weddings, where literally or figuratively the father of the pregnant 16-year-old took out a shotgun and said to the man, you marry her or I blow your head off, so he marries her. Okay. Those are grounds for annulment or good case for annulment. Also in former times more maybe arranged marriage where more with royalty, but you could have it in a business relationship. In royalty, you've heard of many cases where the king and queen arrange their 14-year-old or 15, 16-year-old son or daughter to marry a king of another country in order to join their armies or join their treasuries or things like that. And the son or the daughter really have no choice. Okay, very defective consent. Another grounds that were fairly common is to get out of an abusive home. This is more commonly with females. She was sexually abused from childhood, physically beaten, emotional, psychological abuse. The only way she sees that she can get out of this is marriage, and usually the guy she marries is an alcoholic or a drug addict or irresponsible, but okay, they do it and the marriage lasts 2 or 3 months.
This is case which I'm meeting often with my clients, because this is tendency to choose partners similar to father, and this is unconscious and is ending like this.
Yes.
Should be some support for young people like this.
Yes. I don't know if you heard my friend Maria, the psychologist, from a psychological, she can back this up, where you are sexually, emotionally, physically abused, and so often you marry almost a carbon copy of your. Another fairly common situation you get in the marriage tribunal is where, and it's usually the man, before marriage, says to himself, I will have my wife and I will have a mistress or 2 mistresses, 3 mistresses, girlfriends on the side. Or I will be married, she's quite wealthy, or her parents are, and before the wedding even, he has already made up his mind that he will be married only a few months or a year or something, inherit or legally be entitled to wealth, and then I will divorce her, okay? A case like that. Another case is what's called placing a condition on your marriage consent. In other words, again, he says to his wife-to-be, or the opposite, she to him, I will stay married with you only under condition that we have 5 kids or 6 kids or 8 kids, or I will marry you under the condition that we be millionaires by the time we're 30. Okay, if any marriage has a condition placed on it, it is an invalid. Okay, a marriage consent has to be unconditional. Okay, I could go on forever, but we're under a time limit here. These are theoretical, so canon law gives guidelines. What would possibly, if proven, render a marriage invalid? It's mostly common sense or a judgment call. What happens in an actual study of a marriage to determine whether it was valid in the eyes of the Catholic Church? The one who asks for the annulment is called the petitioner, because you're petitioning an annulment. The other spouse is called the respondent. So the petitioner begins the annulment process by going through an interview. There's a set questionnaire that begins with your home and family background, covers your whole lifespan until that point. The courtship, marriage, early marriage, later marriage, of course, what happened, why did it break down? And it ends with, what have you done with your life since the breakup of the marriage? The respondent, the other spouse, even though they might be separated, divorced 20, 25, 30 years, always has to be contacted and given the opportunity to come and respond. That's why he's called the respondent to the petition for an annulment. If the grounds are against the respondent, like a psychological illness or something, it is very crucial, very valuable to have that person's testimony, and the petitioner is asked to name 2 witnesses. The best witnesses are parents, brother, sister, childhood friend, bridesmaid, groom, who knew the couple from ideally courtship through the marriage. How many of you listening to me would, when a marriage broke down, would say, I gave it 2 weeks at the most. I knew it was a mistake. I begged her not to marry, and so on. You are a very valuable witness to present to the caseworker. I sat her down and I begged. How many parents will say, I cried and cried and begged her, don't marry him, don't this, don't that. These are very good witnesses. So the evidence, like in a civil lawsuit, the evidence is gathered, and the caseworker is a canon lawyer, or at least an experienced tribunal worker, who gathers all the information. Transcripts are made of them, of all the interviews, all the testimonies, and I have to talk here about pre-COVID and COVID. Pre-COVID, tribunal, tri means 3. So you had 3 judges who got transcripts of all the evidence that was gathered. And 2 out of 3 judges have to agree. Affirmative means the annulment is granted. And then otherwise 2 out of 3 grant negative. They give a negative, the evidence isn't strong, it's not obvious, whatever. If 2 out of 3 judges give an affirmative decision, then it's written up in a special form, and there's what's called a review tribunal. It's located in Ottawa. Nothing to do with the federal government. That's the headquarters of the Catholic Conference of Bishops. Their headquarters is in Ottawa, This is where the appeal tribunal is, and they are totally neutral. If a case comes from Victoria, for example, they don't know anybody, but the reason you have this appeal tribunal automatic is, for example, the mayor of Edmonton is a Catholic. He gets the annulment from the local tribunal. Well, what do you say? Wow, what do you expect? He's the mayor of Edmonton. Of course he's going to get an annulment. So this appeal tribunal is totally neutral. The tribunal don't care if they're the mayor or the president of the United States or whoever. And if they approve 2 out of 3, then the annulment is granted. You get a document with that. And then when you want to get remarried, the church that you want to remarry in, you bring that with you like you would your baptismal certificate and so on. And I mentioned pre-COVID, it was literally tribunal. Tri means 3. I was one of the judges on the tribunal, and then COVID came around. There were many layoffs, and personally I got laid off, and so I'm not familiar now, but I think that they only have one judge now, the head of the tribunal, and some cases are handed over to the archbishop directly. In other words, the archbishop is a tribunal or a one-man tribunal. But those are details. So I'll just finish here by saying that whoever divorced Catholic, whoever's listening to this, if you are in a situation where you wish to remarry in the Catholic Church, you wish to apply for an annulment, the head of the tribunal in Edmonton is Father Philip Creuer, spelled Creurer, and the reception at the tribunal is 780-469-4446, 780-469-346. Contact the tribunal, say that this is your situation, you'd like to apply for annulment. He will speak to you directly or assign a caseworker who wasn't laid off to speak to you and get it going.
Thank you. As you explain everything, before I was able to ask question, you explain next and next. You answer already this question what I have in mind, but I have one question yet, because this can be maybe more clear for people who listen this. You talk about witnesses. What can be happened if there is no witnesses? Because people travel a lot in Canada to work. If they move to some, for example, woman moved or man one moved to a new place when nobody know her and she marries someone and there is no family members or other people who can be witnesses. Is this any problem in this case?
Well, first of all, there's the saying, you can't create a witness, okay? A person either was present, friends throughout the marriage, or wasn't. The parents could be dead. You were an only child, so there's no brothers, sisters, or like you said, Maria, you moved from Poland to Canada. What if there are no witnesses? You can't create them, okay? The caseworkers gathers the evidence that you have. If it's a strong case where you have police reports, psychological reports, psychiatrist reports, prison reports, counselors' reports, okay, you don't need, it's like shooting an ant with an elephant gun, okay? When you have all these police statements and lawyers and so on, the witnesses are less important. If a marriage lasted 30 or 35 years, okay, and there are no witnesses, you can't create them. You can only go with the testimony of the petitioner. Okay, obviously you always have that. Hopefully the respondent will cooperate, so you have at least both sides of the story. But never decide not to apply for annulment because you think you have a weak case or because you have weak witnesses. And by weak witnesses, that means somebody who only met you 10 or 15 years later, okay? Apply for it, okay? Literally, you have nothing to lose. Apply for it and see what happens, okay? You might get a negative decision, but at least you knew that in your conscience you applied for an annulment. And the tribunal workers are experts. They see things about your marriage that you don't, or psychologists do. Very often the tribunal will send the transcripts. There's a tribunal appointed, what's called an expert, a psychologist, psychiatrist, who gives an expert's opinion, and they see psychological things. So no matter if you don't have witnesses, if your ex vows that he will never or she will never allow you to get an annulment, apply anyways, okay? You never know what happens.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
I think it was a great presentation, very valuable for people who listen my channel. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me to do this.